Hello, everybody. Good to be with you, if even at a distance. Doug is hurrying up to do something. Okay. All right. Welcome. Today, we're going to talk a little about the Supreme Court and take a look at some very important decisions it has made over the years. And then I imagine you may have questions about other topics that have been in the news. Oh, I don't know, just today, but we'll see how far we get here. So let me just share screen with you. So the U.S. Supreme Court, we've talked about this before. It is the highest court in the land. It has 9 justices, one of whom is the Chief Justice, currently John Roberts. They are appointed for life by presidents and confirmed or not confirmed by the Senate, as we saw happen in near the end of President Obama's second term, when the Senate simply refused to give Merrick Garland a hearing. So once again, I thought Obama perhaps might have played hardball there, but he didn't. So anyway. We have what is called judicial federalism, which is to say we have a dual court system. So there are, of course, state courts. In Washington state, we have municipal courts, which handle traffic tickets and misdemeanors. And then the trial courts are the county superior courts, after which there are 3 state courts of appeal, and then the state Supreme Court. And if you were unhappy with a decision, you could appeal it from the state Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the U.S. Supreme Court only hears cases that involve substantial constitutional questions. So, as people used to say, they'd appeal their traffic ticket all the way up. No, you won't. You wouldn't even get to the Court of Appeals unless your fine was over $300. So there are U.S. federal district courts, 94 of them, and then the 12 circuit courts. And then there's military courts and military court of appeals. There's claims courts, veterans appeals, court of international trade, and court of appeals for the federal circuit. So quite a bit going on there. State judges are chosen in a variety of ways. For example, in Washington, we elect them. We've talked about that. Federal judges are all appointed for life, except for bankruptcy court judges, whose terms are something like 14 years. I don't know why that was decided. I even met a bankruptcy court judge, and he didn't know either. So anyway, Supreme Court has clearly had a big impact on politics and policy in the United States over 2.5 centuries now. The first, and this is a very famous case, Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And what this did was established the idea of judicial review. And the Chief Justice at the time was a guy named John Marshall, and he had been John Adams' Secretary of State when Adams was president. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson won in 1800. So in Marbury versus Madison, near the end of his time as president, John Adams was signing all these appointments, sort of trying to pack the federal judiciary with supporters of his party, the Federalists. They were sort of the Republicans of the day. And the other party, Jefferson's party, was known as the Republicans. In some textbooks, they say the Democratic Republicans, but they never called themselves that. Democracy to them meant rule by the mob, and so nobody wanted to be a Democrat at that point. So Marbury was one of these appointees to the federal judiciary, and Adams had left office, and James Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State, would not sign and send on his commission. And so Marbury sued, and Marshall was a very clever fellow. He could have easily just thrown out the case, but he sort of finagled it to say that, in fact, the court had the ability to invalidate a law as constitutional. And so one of the laws that would have put Marbury into office conflicted with a clause of the Constitution. So that established the power of judicial review. Marshall being, as I said, a rather clever fellow. And that's been an important power for the court ever since. The court can invalidate acts of government as unconstitutional. But the thing about that is somebody has to file suit, right? They can't just decide, well, let's look at this law. That ain't happening. So that was a very important case. The next one, still John Marshall, McCulloch versus Maryland. And what was going on here was that Maryland was attempting to tax the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was, for a time, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve today. So it managed monetary policy for the country, and it actually didn't do too bad of a job, but a lot of people didn't like the federal government to have that much power. Private banks were complaining because, I mean, they actually had offices, you could actually bank there, say, unlike the Fed. And so Maryland attempted to tax the Bank of the United States, which was, the bank was unpopular in some circles, popular in others. And in making this decision, Marshall and the court majority said that, in fact, the states could not interfere with what the federal government could do. And so this established, in many ways, the federal government as, at least in some spheres of operation, superior to the state government. So that was a very, very important decision. It's worth noting, the Bank of the United States got a second charter eventually, and then when Andrew Jackson became president, he managed to torpedo the Bank of the United States. What that meant was that for almost the next 100 years, the United States had no instrument of monetary policy. They couldn't really control the money supply. And as a consequence, we had a serious recession about every dozen years. And some people have argued that basically from the 1870s to the 1890s, we had a depression because there was not enough money in circulation. Because there was really no way to increase the amount of money in circulation. So while the economy was clearly growing, population was growing, and we were getting more productive, there wasn't enough cash to go around. So ultimately, in the 19 teens, the government, after having watched a number of what they called panics, they said, we need a central bank. And so they created the Federal Reserve System. So, all right. And the last of our cases that basically deal with the power of the federal government, Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. And what this case was about was that states, in this instance, Louisiana and New York, were awarding exclusive contracts to steamship companies that were, plying the waters, so that somebody else couldn't then go and do business there. They granted monopolies to these firms, and Gibbons, who wanted to run his own steamship line, sued. And what this case established, because he won, what this case established was the ability of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. So those steamships were going to other states. So the states could not legally say, no, nobody else can run this route. So that was a very important decision. So those three decisions really kind of established what the federal government could do, and in some ways, one could argue, made us a country as opposed to a collection of states. So now this case, Dred Scott versus Sanford, this is regarded as probably one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court ever made. The man on the left is Roger Taney. He was by then the Chief Justice. And so Dred Scott was a slave, and his owner took him to live in a couple of different free states before taking him back to a slave state. And Scott sued and said, look, he'd lived in a free state and slavery was outlawed there, and therefore he had to be free. And what Justice Taney wrote was that Black people were essentially not citizens of the United States and therefore did not have these rights, could not be free. And so he basically said that slavery was legal. Of course, not long after that, we were in the middle of a war to decide that question. So not a very good decision. Now we jump ahead here. This is another really sort of bad decision, Korematsu versus United States, 1944. So as you undoubtedly know, at this outset of our involvement in World War II, the government decided that all these Japanese Americans, citizens and otherwise, posed a security risk. And so they gathered them all up and basically put them in concentration camps. They didn't kill them, but they took away their livelihoods. They were forced to abandon their property, sold their businesses at a loss. The only way out was basically to volunteer for military service. That particular Japanese American unit was the most decorated of the war, in part because they sent them into the worst possible situations. Mr. Korematsu served as well, by the way. But what the court ruled with this decision was that it was okay for the government to identify a group of people simply by race and decide they were a threat. So ultimately, the government has apologized for this. Reparations have been paid, but still, it was just an absolutely ridiculous decision. I mean, I knew people who served in I think it was the 442nd, and with distinction. But a friend of mine, she said her dad told her, and her family had lost a lot of stuff because of this. He said, never trust a white guy. And I thought, I can't blame you for that statement. So anyway, another really, really bad decision. It's just, out and out racism. I'm sorry. Now here is when things begin to turn around. Brown versus Board of Education. The man in the middle of that picture is a gentleman named Thurgood Marshall, who went to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. So in 1897, in another particularly bad decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, the court at that time had ruled that, in fact, segregation was okay as long as the facilities, being denied to African Americans were separate but equal. And of course, that's not how that worked out. Black public facilities were always of inferior quality. And of course, there's just the whole notion of, can you go where you want to go, right? With, can you vote? Can you do all those things? And so the Brown family sued after their daughter was denied admission into an all-white high school in Topeka, Kansas. And they sued, and what the court ruled in this case was that separate was inherently unequal, and therefore segregation could not stand. Now, of course, it took us a long time to get over that. You may remember George Wallace, who started out as a fairly moderate guy, sold his soul for political gain, and ultimately infamous for having said at one rally, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It was too bad. It was awful, really. I mean, he legitimized evil actions that followed simply by talking that way. And he could have done so much more because he had great political skills. But in any case, the other thing that happened in the South afterwards was basically white flight. People who could afford it moved their children out of public schools and into private schools so that they wouldn't have to be next to Black people. And I have relatives down there, and in my lifetime, they kind of talk that way. And I'm just like, they're just folks, really, at the end of the day. So that was an important decision. Started us on the path towards sort of a more racially tolerant society. Now, this is really a very interesting case, Gideon versus Wainwright. Clarence Gideon was a guy, you can see the picture, a pretty ordinary guy. He had a record, and he got arrested for, knocking over a convenience store or a pool hall or something like that. At this time in the state of Florida, you were only assigned an attorney if it was a capital case, right? So if you were charged with murder, you're going to get an attorney. Otherwise, you're on your own. And so Gideon was not a man of means. He could not afford an attorney, and he was convicted because he was, he had no skills for defending himself in court. So Gideon goes to jail.
No, he does not.
An AER?
So Gideon goes to jail, and but he starts writing, and he starts writing to judges. And one of his letters gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, and one of the justices saw it, and they were looking for a case like this. And so they assigned him an attorney, and they argued, and the court ruled that you had a right to an attorney even if you couldn't afford one. So Gideon was then assigned the country's first public defender. There was a retrial, and the public defender pretty much demolished the state's case against Gideon because he hadn't committed the crime, and they really didn't have good evidence that he did. So Gideon went off free. So just a fascinating case, and I like this case in large part because here's an ordinary guy, and for him the system worked. So better that it works sometimes than not at all. Now this next case, which is also pretty interesting, Miranda versus Arizona, and this is the case that gave us the now famous Miranda rights. They have to tell you, if you got arrested, the police are supposed to say, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. So odd case, really. So Miranda was accused of kidnapping and rape, and he's being interrogated by the police, and he agrees to he signs a confession, but they didn't tell him that anything he said could and would be used against him. So his attorney appeals, and ultimately the Supreme Court decided that, it doesn't matter. You have to tell somebody. Here's the rules of how this works. Miranda was not a good guy, and that's one of the things that makes this case kind of odd. On retrial, the state convicted him of the crime using evidence that they had. Miranda got out on parole in 1972, and then a few years later was killed in a bar fight. So he was not sort of an upstanding citizen. So, but the Miranda rights have probably helped a number of people who were innocent. So there's that. Now there was a movie about this recently, Loving versus Virginia in 1957. The Lovings, who, as you can see, were a mixed race couple, and they were convicted under Virginia law. It was illegal to marry someone of a different race, and they were both sentenced to a year in jail for having done this. They didn't go to jail, and they lost their trial, and then they appealed, and ultimately the Supreme Court said that no, you couldn't bar something like this that other people in society enjoy simply because of their race. And so this was called miscegenation, this idea of the mixing of the races, which people still get their knickers in a twist about, sadly. So the Lovings were acquitted, and these laws promptly disappeared from around the country, once again, mostly in the South. So now this, of course, is a very famous case. You're probably familiar with this, Roe versus Wade. This happened in Texas. Texas had several laws that basically barred abortion. And Jane Roe, which was, her stage name for the trial, sued the state, and ultimately the court at that time ruled that this was a right of privacy, that a woman had the right to choose, and with some restrictions. And it's kind of interesting because what you find is among people in politics, it seems to be either or. In fact, survey research shows consistently that Americans favor a woman's right to choose with limitations, which has given us in part, which trimester. And the accepted law was that you could do this before a fetus would be viable if it was taken from the womb. We are fighting this battle all over again. For some folks, this is the only issue on both sides of this. Given the court's conservative tilt at the moment, it'll be interesting to see. States are now doing things once again in the South, what a wonderful part of the country, that will ultimately end up in court. And their hope of these folks is to see Roe versus Wade overturned. The irony of this, and I have heard people say this, wealthy conservatives will sometimes say, oh, if we needed to get an abortion, we could get one. It's the other people who shouldn't have them, I guess. So there is not consistency there in how this issue is viewed. Clearly, some people have, this feeling that it's murder, and other people say, well, it's about choice. I'm not trying to persuade you one way or another. I'm just not in the habit of telling people what they can do with their bodies, but that's just me. So still a controversial decision. Now, this is a case that it might have a little bearing on what's happening with us today. United States versus Nixon. This is when he claimed executive privilege that he didn't have to turn over materials such as the tapes. I mean, think of this. The guy taped himself in the Oval Office, in part apparently because he thought he could make money or get a tax write-off or something from turning over these records. But then they found out that the tapes existed, and the court ultimately said that the president does not have the right to withhold evidence, basically. So I wonder if that will ever come back to bite the most recent former president as his various trials work their way through the courts. So you might have noted the other day that Mr. Trump, on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, called him a genius, called Mr. Putin a genius, which has even made some Republicans blanch. So. And then finally, Obergefell versus Hodges. And this is the case that basically legalized same-sex marriage, or as my same-sex friends say, as we call it, marriage, for different groups of people. And Obergefell and Hodges went to Maryland and got married where it was legal, and then they returned to Ohio and attempted to get a marriage license there. One of them was dying, and they wanted to get married so that the survivor would get the other one's benefits, and which is something anybody would want for their spouse. And Ohio refused, and so they sued, and the court ruled. And this was, a conservative court that made this decision. That basically, if something is offered in one state, things have to be honored in other states. And so this, at least for the moment, ended this issue. And in the 7 years since this has happened, the Republic has not collapsed, and God has not struck us down. So I tend to think that was probably a decent decision. I do not have time in my life to worry about who loves who. I've got my own fish to fry, so to speak. So there we go. There are a lot of Supreme Court decisions that we might have looked at, but I thought these were the interesting and
You should have been eating new dessert pastries.
So anyway, let's get rid of that. And now I'm going to guess that you will have questions, right? So please go ahead. Anything else you want to talk about, or you want to ask anything about the courts? I don't mind. I am here for you. It's probably hard with so many people in the big room. But
TM,
Yes, surely.
repeat. In Roe versus Wade, you said there were some restrictions. Now, what were those restrictions, or?
If
Well,
if I remember correctly, a subsequent decision said that you basically had to have an abortion before the third trimester, because after that you would have a viable fetus.
yeah, I thought, yeah,
I think that's right. I think that's right.
thank you. I remember that now.
Yeah, and like I said, all the research I've done says most Americans are okay with that. You know, can't fault somebody for you know, having strong feelings about this, but you know, it's not a majority position that there should be no abortions. So Texas is trying very hard to do away with them, and I gather there's a lot of people getting abortions before some new Texas restriction takes effect. So Mississippi has also made it very difficult to get. And of course, who this affects, you know, is poor people. There's one school of thought that argues that the reason that the crime rate fell, and before the pandemic, it had been falling for 20 years, was this coincided with Roe versus Wade, because it meant millions fewer unwanted children born every year. You know, so if children have to be born and their parents don't want them, it's not difficult to imagine that they're going to have difficult lives. You know, that they didn't start out with those things that sort of help you be a happier, better person if your family doesn't want you. So, and I think there's probably some truth to that. I don't know it for a fact, but it's a very plausible theory. Good question. Other questions? Someday we'll be live again, and this will all be much easier. But no one's going to ask about Ukraine?
That's the main question in the chapel right now, is about.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yeah. All right. So Ukraine, Putin indeed ordered the Russian military into Ukraine, and people are dying and things are blowing up. And I can't tell you how it's going, other than that Trump thinks Putin's a genius. So Putin is he's in a, to some extent, a precarious position. He's not popular with a lot of people in Russia. They have no recourse to removing him from office. I have heard that if he steps down from office, he'll be killed, right? He's got enemies, and he's made lots of enemies. And he has turned what was beginning to be a democratic state into basically an authoritarian one. I was using the example of the Russian Duma as a not a democratic legislature. People get elected, but you know, they're going to rubber stamp whatever the boss says. So he is concerned about having NATO on his borders, and historically, you know, Russia's been invaded a number of times by Darius and the Persian Empire, by Charles X of Sweden, by Napoleon, by Adolf Hitler. And so that's historically a Russian concern. And one of his demands is that nobody in Eastern Europe should belong to NATO. Well, that's not going to change, right? Because they've been invaded by, they were invaded by the Soviets. So they have basically the same set of concerns. Ukraine has been part of the Russian Empire at some times, and sometimes not others. In any case, Putin's discontent with the whole situation peaked in 2014 when a pro-Russian president was basically chased out of office. He was in the process of dismantling their military, and doing everything he could to return it to the arms of Mother Russia. It seems that probably part of this is distracting the people at home, although from what I read, the war is not terribly popular with most people in Russia. They, like us, had a long and unpleasant experience in Afghanistan. And as I've said before, all over the world, my sense is that most people don't want war. It is leaders who make this happen, sadly. So he's concerned about security. He's concerned about his own security. And he seems to be a very insecure, unhappy fellow. So he appears to be seeing how far he can push the West. Now, on the other side, here we have President Biden, and going to war, Putin said that he would unleash all kinds of hell on the rest of the world, which is clearly a veiled reference to pushing the button and firing nukes. And who knows if he's bluffing or serious, and who wants to find out, right? So that's a problem. On the other hand, Americans are probably not champing at the bit to go to war overseas once again, although liberating Ukraine would probably be more rewarding than trying to pacify Afghanistan. I'm not sure I want to see us go to war either. War is just never good, unless you're, saving yourself. So sanctions have a really poor record of getting anybody to do anything unless they affect the people in charge, particularly if the country was such that they could simply vote him out of office because they're tired of war and sanctions, then they would work. But of course, democratic states are not the ones that most often go to war, us notwithstanding. On the other hand, if the sanctions can affect the people on top, that may help. Now, China, which is siding with Russia, because I think they just like sticking it to us, they're buying Russian wheat to try to lessen the impact of sanctions. And the Chinese diplomat said the other day that the West was simply spreading fear. And then the invasion came. It's like, really? Did you think anybody was going to believe you when you said that? So the Ukrainians don't want to be part of Russia, as far as I can tell. So they will defend their country. And it's not clear sort of how far Putin will go. Will he try to overthrow the government there, or will he simply blow up a lot of stuff and, having made his point, leave? So it's an ugly situation. It makes me unhappy. As I said, this is like the first serious war in Europe. You could argue that the Balkan conflict was pretty serious for the people who were in it, but the biggest war in Europe since World War II, and that's not a good thing, right? I mean, other than defending ourselves from Hitler, most of the wars we've been in don't make a lot of sense. So I wish President Biden well. I'm sure that whatever he does, there will be just many people unhappy because, hey, we're Americans and we want it perfect. We want it all, and we want it for free. So there you go. What else? Suzanne, you're gonna need to unmute yourself there. You're gonna need to unmute yourself.
Do you think that
There you go.
America will become involved in a ground war?
No, not unless it goes farther than Ukraine. I don't think there's the political will at the moment to do that. As soon as American men and women start dying in a foreign country again, that tends to make people unhappy. We've had our share of war in the last few decades, and I think that's even giving some Republicans pause. So now, if Putin goes completely crazy and decides now he's going to invade Poland and other places, that may change. But clearly, something has to happen to stand up and make it clear that there will be consequences to that kind of violent aggression.
what is required to unseat Putin?
Well, he's basically sort of president for life, so I don't know that they have the government mechanism available, the electoral mechanism available to remove him from office. Perhaps if a huge majority in the Duma, the Russian parliament, voted against him, then maybe something would change. But then again, he might just shut that bad boy down. Probably what would get Putin out of office are two things. One, a gun, and two, he gets sick and dies. So he's basically a fascist. I mean, if you look at pictures of Mussolini back in the day in Italy with his shirt off, throwing bales of hay, working with farmers, and then in recent years, pictures of Putin with no shirt, riding horseback. I just thought, I've seen that image before, and it wasn't a good one. This is not a good look. So he's sort of drunk his own Kool-Aid at this point. He thinks he's doing the right thing, and whatever he's doing is the right thing. So he's somebody that needs to go. It to me, it just makes so much more sense. How do you make your country a better place, help people live better lives? Then they'll actually like you, perhaps. So we'll see. I hope to outlive him. I'll say that.
I had something to tell you.
Please do.
This is an experience. Well, I have a granddaughter who was skiing in the country on the Black Sea.
She was in Ukraine or a different country?
No, she was in the country by the Black Sea. It's north. It's
In the Crimea?
no, but the country.
Okay. She was over there.
She was skiing, and she just got back yesterday.
Ah,
She said as they left, I'll remember the place, as they left where they were skiing up in the mountains, that the cab driver was taking them to the airport, and the guns were bombing Ukraine at that time.
wow. Wow. So
And
she was
so
close enough to hear it.
She asked the cab driver, what do you think? I mean, if they do take over Ukraine, what do you think will happen to your country? And he said, I'm sure he would come here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sure
because they already have had 2 wars apparently,
Mhm.
where Russia has taken 2 different parts of the country.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So-
It hasn't been pretty.
No,
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like the guy who tried to reassemble AT&T, but with guns. Interesting. Thank you for sharing.
I'll look up where she was.
No, it's all right. There are several countries along the Baltic, so the Black Sea, I mean.
Was it Georgia?
Yes. Oh, the country of Georgia. They have ripped off.
Yes, yes, it was. It was Georgia.
Was Georgia? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they had a so-called separatist movement. Russians under Putin are very good at starting trouble. I'll give them that. Suzanne.
Is Estonia vulnerable?
Well, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, under these circumstances, yes, they're all vulnerable. I believe there are some American soldiers there, and those folks have fought and wanted their independence for quite some time. So when the Soviet Union broke up, they finally got it back. And Estonia, I believe, is the one that has it has a little piece of Russia on the coastline, and then two sizable Russian minority in the country. So it would not be a surprise to see Putin try to destabilize that state as well. That one we might have a little bit more to say about, because I believe they're connected to NATO. I'm guessing off the top of my head there, sorry. What else? What else can I tell you? It would not surprise me if the attack went on for several days and then they pulled back, having made their point, and probably ripping off some more of Ukraine. They've taken Crimea. There are two now. Putin recognizes them as independent republics, but they're just, little bits reclaimed for Russia in far eastern Ukraine. Before all this happened, Ukraine was, in fact, the largest country in Europe outside of Russia. One of those tricks of the map. You look at the map and you think, oh, it's not that big, but apparently it was. So the challenge for Europe, of course, is that they rely on natural gas, and the natural gas comes from Russia. And one of Russia's threats is, if you don't play ball with us, we'll simply shut off your natural gas. If I was the Europeans, I would be looking for alternatives. That's just not a tenable situation. So. Anything else? Douglas, any of the folks in the den room there have another question, or? This is, of course, so much easier when we're in person, but yes, Suzanne, go ahead. Mute, you got to unmute.
I've just finished reading a book about Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes.
How close to her model do you think the new selection will be?
Oh gosh, that's an excellent question, and I don't know how to begin to answer that. I mean, she was smart and feisty, and everything you'd like to see in a justice. She had a good mind and a mind of her own. There's some criticism of her is that she should have retired earlier, when Obama might have nominated someone to replace her. When you nominate a Supreme Court justice, you're looking for somebody you think will make good decisions, uphold the rule of law, consider cases on their merits, not on ideology, but then, of course, they have to get confirmed. So at least at present, President Biden can't go too far to the left or to the right, really, because, you've got some liberals in the Senate the so-called progressives, who might say, no, that's not the person that we want. So there's a lot to be navigated there. The old saw used to be that the justices don't always turn out like the presidents had hoped. And that was a statement about Earl Warren. Earl Warren had been governor of California, and he was a solid Republican. And then when he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he led this really massive expansion of civil liberties. It was the Warren Court that decided Brown versus Board of Education, and the Loving decision, and all those other sort of middle group of decisions that we looked at. And And what I had read originally was that President Eisenhower, who had nominated him, was disappointed. But in fact, I've later read that Eisenhower, who we now think was sort of smarter than he got credit for at the time, knew exactly what he was doing and thought that these kinds of things should happen. And so even though he made it seem like, oh, this is not what I wanted, that is in fact really what he wanted. So the other thing that comes into this in play, if you may notice, is that nobody gets nominated past a certain age because you're hoping that this person will serve for a long time so that they'll continue to render the kind of decisions that you want to see happen. So the person will not be, they can't be too young, they won't have enough experience, right? But they can't be too old because then perhaps they won't be there that long. So the one place that they'll be different is that whoever gets nominated will be much younger than Justice Ginsburg. So,
That's all you're gonna say.
yeah.
Oh,
I gather he's got 3 or 4 candidates that he's looking at. The president is, and so now they have to be vetted, as they say. They have to go through everything they've ever said and done and written, and see have they done something that's going to make people in the Senate go, whoa, Nelly, we can't have that. So yeah, you have to have a fairly spotless record in some ways, in any case. But you think back, I mean. People who got turned down, say back in the 80s, there was a guy named Daniel Ginsburg, and it was a well-regarded legal scholar, etc. And then it came out that he'd smoked some marijuana in college, and that torpedoed his nomination right there. They had to withdraw him. Now they withdrew. Ronald Reagan withdrew his nomination of Robert Bork because he was really far too conservative for the country at that time. And the Senate made clear this guy's not going to pass through. George W. Bush at one point attempted to nominate his personal attorney, who was a woman and probably a perfectly good attorney, but she was clearly did not have the experience to be a Supreme Court justice, and so that nomination was withdrawn. So I think it's too bad. The guy that Obama nominated, who didn't get a hearing, Merrick Garland, I think would have probably been a really good judge. He was apparently quite moderate. He wouldn't have moved the court sharply one way or another, and to my mind, that's not a bad thing. And, they're more likely to decide cases based on the merit rather than on ideology. For example, the decision that basically handed the 2000 election to George Bush when the court ordered the stop of the recount in Florida, and Bush got Florida, even though there were all kinds of irregularities there. I mean, that was clearly a purely political decision. And that's not what you want to see happen. Gore's big mistake was to ask for a recount only in 6 counties. He should have asked for it in the whole state. And that would have been easier to defend. So the court has done good in history, and it has done bad. When railroads were the dominant economic interest in the country, the Supreme Court, in a matter of years, ruled that the federal government couldn't regulate railroads because they had no competition, so they could charge whatever they wanted. The federal government couldn't regulate railroads because that was up to the states. And then in a separate decision a few years later, they said, no, the states couldn't regulate railroads because that was up to the federal government. So it's like Sesame Street. 2 of these things don't belong together. You can't have both of those decisions. They're mutually exclusive. Anyway. Any requests for next time? Anything you might think you want to talk about? Let me know one way or another. I'm glad to see you all, even if only electronically. If you do not have other questions.
it would be interesting to hear your assessment of the nominee for the.
Well,
Sup-
if,
Sure.
if someone has been nominated and they have not yet been confirmed by the time we meet again, yeah, I can certainly touch on that.
Thank you.
Of course, of course. Of course. Anything else? All right, then. You all take care. Be safe over there. Keep treating yourselves well. I look forward to being with you again soon. And who knows, maybe someday down the line we'll be in person again, which is just always better. See all your smiling faces, etc. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Talk to you soon.